Afade, buenas. Thank you all for being here. The Committee on Culture and Justice is now called to order. Today's Monday, November 13, 2017. The time is 10 a.m. Notices for this public hearing were disseminated via email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets on November 21 and again on November 9, 2017. The notice was also published in the Guam Daily Post on November 3 and in the Pacific Daily News on November 4, 9, 11, and 13, 2017. We have two agenda items for today, Bill number 164 and Bill number 195. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues, Senator Joe San Augustine, Senator Will Castro, and our Legislative Secretary, Regine Bisco-Lee. The first item on our agenda will be Bill number 164. Bill number 164 is introduced by J.S. San Augustine, B.J.F. Cruz. It's an act to add a new section 2120 to Chapter 2, Title 19 of the Guam Code Annotated, relative to protection against discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identification, and gender expression. I would like to ask those who have signed up to testify to come to the table. I'm going to read from the sign-in sheet, and if you would like to present oral testimony, please proceed to the table. Dr. Ron McNinch, Alana Chargaloff, Lacia Casil, Scarlett Dixon, Brian Dixon. If there's anyone else who would like to testify, please see my staff, and we'll get your name on here also. Before we hear from the panel, I would like to invite Senator San Augustine to provide introductory remarks on Bill number 164-34 LS.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Vice Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, the bill that I've introduced, Bill 164, and co-sponsored by the Speaker, B.J. Cruz, actually started when I was on the Board of Education. When I was on the Board of Education, a student came in at the board and said that he was being discriminated because of what he was dressed in. I asked him, says, what are you talking about? And he was asking if there was a policy at the Department of Education at that time. I said, what is the policy you're asking for? He said, he went to the prom and he was dressed as a female. And I said, and what's wrong with that? And I asked the board, my fellow board, and the superintendent then, is there a policy against that? And they said, there's none. I said, okay, so what's the problem? I asked the student, he said he wanted to get reimbursed because he was denied to go to his prom. I said, then that should be granted. I asked the superintendent, and that was granted. Getting to the bill, it's about preventing discrimination of any individual, maybe male or female, in what they want to dress in. A couple of individuals approached me as they were applying for jobs because their driver's license identifies their sex and it wasn't the same as what they were dressed in. They were denied an opportunity. They were actually given high rating in their position. Their opportunity was there to get employed, but when they went to the interview, that's where they were being discriminated. And that's one of the issues why I brought this up, and that you will find on the bill, it finds that the legislature, the people of Guam are protected against various forms of discrimination based on sections of the United States Constitution and the Organic Act of Guam, as well as other federal and local laws. However, the protection against discrimination based on sex remains ambiguous in regard to gender identity and gender expression. I'm hoping that this bill will develop the rights of human beings to equal treatment in government and in public places. It is necessary to clarify the definition of sex to include gender identity and gender expression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go any further, I'd like to recognize the presence of our Vice Chairman, Senator Talina Nelson. Thank you all for being here. Bill 164, I'm going to read part of the new section that will be added to the code, and subsection A is a declaration of purpose, subsection B is the prohibition against discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identification, and gender expression. All persons within the jurisdiction of Guam, no matter what their sex, gender identification, or gender expression, are entitled to the full and equal accommodations, advantages, facilities, privileges, or services in all business establishments of every kind whatsoever and in all government agencies. Subsection C adds definitions of sex, gender identity or expression, and Section 3 of the bill is a severability clause. All right, we'll now accept testimony from the panel, beginning with Dr. McNinch.
Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker and honorable senators. It's always a pleasure to be able to speak to the Guam Legislature, and it's certainly my honor to do so today. I've submitted a draft testimony, and I'll probably be updating it just a little bit to reflect these remarks, which I'll do later today. My name is Ron McNinch. I'm testifying as an individual. However, I'm influenced by my role as a UOG faculty member and faculty leader. I'm a Senate leader at the university. Also, I'm on the Guam Department of Education School Board. And I would like to say I'm always pleased to see the Guam Legislature address and discuss and promote policy efforts to improve civil rights for our citizens. And I'm always very pleased to see that, and I congratulate Speaker Cruz and also Senator St. Augustine in this effort. It's a very, very important effort, and I want to point that out as just a preface note. There's a point that I wanted to mention also related to something Senator St. Augustine just said. He mentioned a prom case. You can give the young person their money back. You can never give them the experience back. You know, that experience happens one time. And I think it's very sad that some of these applications of policies work out that way. And I have to say, as a board member myself, I would take a very dim view of treating students in that way. And I just want to be very, very blunt about that. I have to say that I have just a very, very few quick, brief comments, and I'll include them in my written testimony. First, as far as education goes vis-a-vis this policy and the application of policy, education in terms of the University of Guam, which has a separate Board of Regents, the Guam Community College, which has a separate Board of Trustees, and the Guam Department of Education, I believe this concept should be addressed at the policy levels within those institutions to pattern the educational background. And I have to say, I am very dismayed to hear your preface story. Those kinds of things shouldn't happen in this day and age. But I think that we have to worry about probably 40,000 students in all of our systems, and we want to make sure that we balance all of the interests appropriately in the right sorts of ways vis-a-vis this policy accommodation. The second thing I'd like to mention, I did mention this in my written testimony, is what concerns me is having convicted registered sex offenders take advantage of a law like this. And so I would like certainly the legislature to have fruitful discussion and interest in the details of that, and I think it's self-explanatory. There are persons by their own bad behaviors who should not benefit from advanced civil rights protections. We don't allow felons to vote. There's no reason we should allow them to basically under the guise of civil rights do other things that interfere with the rights of others. So that was another point that I wanted to mention. On the business side, there's a concern, and it's a legitimate concern, that businesses should be more involved in this type of process for this type of policy. And so the question I would have, and this is on my public policy hat as a professor, would this law allow a person to go to their local gym, a male, could I walk off the street as a male and walk into a local gym and use the female showers? That's something we should probably, a detail we need to work out. Should I be able to go to the Hilton in the public showers as a male, and I'm a male, I live as a male, and walk into the female showers along with our tourists, declaring that I have some exception? And I think that there are legitimate questions we should raise and discuss at a policy level. I advocate and protect the interests of civil rights, and I advocate for my gay and LGBT students, and I want to see them protected and treated right. I sincerely mean that. But on the other hand, we have to be careful of persons in our community who have ill intents, and we need to balance those two concerns judiciously. On a final note, and I do appreciate you letting me going first. I have to rush off to class at the university. I really appreciate it. We have a problem on Guam enforcing civil rights. Other than the courts, nobody views it as their role to enforce civil rights. I don't think the Attorney General enforces civil rights. Maybe the Attorney General should. The question is, in my campus, civil rights are enforced by the faculty, they're enforced by the administration, and that's why education is a little bit different. But civil rights in general society, basically, individuals have trouble seeking relief, particularly from the courts. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we have to maybe develop a strategy that doesn't rely on courts, which take a very, very long time to address immediate civil rights interests. And I call it like a Judge Wapner referee. You know, the referee, you come in, you tell them your issue, and then they, within a very short period of time, they give the answer. We need that in terms of civil rights. Otherwise, that young person misses their prom. If that young person had applied to the court and they'd have to have a lawyer, they'd have to spend a huge amount of money. If it's a civil rights issue, there's a civil rights referee that can make determinations. And I'm just using that as a suggestion. It could be a simple appointee in the Attorney General's office. It doesn't have to be a major office. It could just be the designee that makes these decisions to keep the moment from being missed. And for me, the most poignant part about your vignette, Mr. Senator, about the prom, is you can never experience a prom again. Your senior prom's your senior prom. It's the moment. And so certainly we should be accommodating and treat all people with respect and treat people with dignity and treat people with a general heartful interest that our community so reflects all the time. And I do appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and I do appreciate your kind effort by letting me go first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McNinch. If you're leaving, does the panel have any questions for Dr. McNinch? I do. Senator Nelson.
Good morning, Dr. McNinch.
Good morning.
Thank you for your testimony today. I believe we received testimony on this bill. And you stated at the very end, if you want these rights to be actually enforced, you need to provide a remedy other than the courts to provide it. And I believe you just spoke on this. Guam courts are rarely concerned about civil rights, and this is a failure of the legislature. If you want these rights enforced, you have to make sure the courts know you view them as a priority or provide a civil rights referee to enforce them. Can you just perhaps explain a little bit more what you,
Sure.
Concretely give us something, an example, because it's pretty vague, so maybe something concrete?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Civil rights are never an issue for people who are not affected by the civil rights concern at hand. So if I'm not affected, if I'm allowed to vote, nobody's interfering with my vote, I'm not affected by it. But once I'm affected by it, it becomes a priority for me. And so then the question is, what is the remedy? What is the solution when I'm affected? Well, traditionally in our society, we're so court-oriented, we vested the courts with these heavy-duty powers, and they're great at doing that. It's just the process takes so long. And I don't know whether it's fair to the courts or fair to the public to have to hire lawyers, which are very expensive. And also, and I study the judiciary, that's one of my functional areas, I study judges. A lot of people are intimidated by courts. And it'd be much better if there was a simple referee in the AG's office or a referee in the Office of Public Auditor that a person could turn to, and they could get a call, yes or no, or I agree or don't agree, and get a quick call on it. Because what I'm afraid of is there's an old saying in criminal justice. I teach criminal justice at the university. In criminal justice, the process is the punishment. And so when a person tries to enforce their civil rights, it's a burden on them. It's tough. You have to have guts to go to court. You have to have guts to give a lawyer $5,000 to go and take your case up, regardless of how strongly you feel about it. And especially people who are really affected negatively by civil rights, quite often they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to do that. And so I think a bureaucratic function initially, like a referee, I call it a referee, like in the AG's office, just a designee, the AG's referee for civil rights. And that person gives the quick call, not the extended legal opinion, just this is an enforcement issue. They send a note to the person in the enforcement stream, and then it happens. So for example, the young person denied from the prom, they complain to the AG equivalent of consumer affairs, but actually it's civil rights affairs. They come out with a very quick ruling, and then the school system is told, knock it off, let this young person go to their prom. Hopefully I cleared that up. And I didn't mean to sound so snarky in my testimony. I'm going to correct that in my next draft. I love the courts, by the way. It's just they're tough for the average citizen.
Okay, and then so what you're recommending is that we put a little bit more emphasis within the AG's office on a civil rights attorney designated with some kind of authority to say, hey, you're infringing on the civil rights of an individual, and give them that authority within the policy that we are building here. Sure.
Give whoever a letter of comment saying this is a concern. This is kind of how Title IX works in the Department of Education. Yes. You complain to Title IX, and then they agree with you. They send a letter saying, hey, in these kinds of cases, when you have a very narrow window like the prom, it should be done very deliberately. And I'll tell you, a rational call would have been a nice 3-minute conversation with the right people, and that person should have been known exactly what route they're supposed to have taken. And I think that in general, everybody loves a judge and everybody loves a referee. The referee makes the call, you follow the rule. So.
Thank you, Dr. Minich.
Thank
you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much. Did you have any other questions for Dr. McNinch?
No, the only thing, Dr. McNinch, is what, maybe something like what the federal government has, they have an ombudsman. Maybe that's what we need to identify the AG's office, an ombudsman that not only handles this issue, but all other civil rights, so they can get, instead of waiting for the courts to decide.
Yeah, I think, I would call it a referee, whatever you want to call it, but that person a person should not have to go to court first. Right. They should get the call. And actually the AG, if the AG agrees with the person, then the AG should carry the ball on it and enforce the law. Because the question is, who enforces the law? In my view, it should be the AG. If somebody violates a person's civil rights here, the AG should be first in line saying, hey, civil rights violated, we're not going to put up with it. And nothing hurts more than to see a person mistreated civil rights-wise. And I hate seeing it. I speak up. I'm a loudmouth. But I'm a loudmouth, and I pay my dues for being a loudmouth. There's a penalty for being vocal. Okay. And not everybody can pay the penalty. Right, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Wait, we have one more question from Senator Lee.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Minich. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going through your input on the bill, and on numbers 4 and 5 of your testimony, you're talking about a suggestion that you're making to request that registered sex offenders or persons arrested or indicted for sex offenses be exempted from these protections. And then you go on further in number 5. As a husband, father, and citizen, I do not want registered or accused sex offenders using this bill to access public area restrooms. And we take a lot of these recommendations from the public very seriously. We try to incorporate it into our bills as it moves along the process. So I'm just trying to wrap my mind around those statements, and then maybe if you have any facts that, or any data that would kind of demonstrate that.
Absolutely. There are over 600 registered sex offenders on Guam. They've all been convicted. Almost all of them are felons. 200 odd are incarcerated. I used to use them as a study group. I see them all over the place because I've looked at every one of their pictures all the time. They're everywhere.
I understand. I'm just not seeing the connection between that and this bill.
Because a registered sex offender, if we don't bar them from claiming that they're like a male, mainly, I'm going to tell you, this is a male problem. It's not a female problem. I'm worried about men who are sex offenders, the wolf in sheep's clothing type, going into a female's restroom or female shower room or whatever, claiming that they're, on another gender, and using or exploiting the genuine civil rights purposes of this law. So these are people with ill intentions. They're not persons who deserve a civil rights protection because they're expressing their gender identity, which I fully support. I'm always an advocate of transgender people and LGBT people. But I think I'm talking about those who have already been convicted of their ill intentions, and allowing a male like this to go into a female's restroom. I have to say, this is a bigger problem than we like to talk about here. And we already know from news reports what a big problem sex offenders are on Guam. And by the way, this is a particular criminal personality, and they will use every method possible to exploit particularly their victims, particularly female victims in the case of certain male sex offenders, or children victims in the cases of pedophiles. So we want to be a little bit judicious on that, and I think that there are other states or other models that you can take a look at that might have the language you can incorporate.
Actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because as of March 2017, I know that 19 states, the District of Columbia, and over 200 municipalities have really moved forward with anti-discrimination laws and ordinances allowing transgender people to use public facilities that correspond to their gender identity. And we've heard some of these claims before, right? And as a mother of 2 young children, I absolutely want to protect my kids and make sure that they are safe, and, especially with, some of the issues that you're raising. But I think the facts are that anti-discrimination protections covering gender identity have actually been around for years. And there's no real evidence that leads us to believe that attacks in public facilities, that there's a correspondence there. So I'm just trying to wrap my mind around that, and I'm looking at some information that's available via the Williams Institute, and I'm looking at information that's available, via multiple news networks across the country that, have actual examples of this being instituted in over 200 municipalities, and it's just not something that, we want to make sure that the policies that we're creating are based in fact and based in research. And so that's why I'm really just trying to wrap my mind around numbers 4 and 5 and where you're kind of making those connections. Sure.
Well, I think the connection is very clear, and I think maybe I didn't state it right. Like I said, I got to probably rework it. I think it's very, very important to note a person who is transgender, who's using public facilities, is a genuine transgender person using public facilities. I think where the concern comes in is when you have people who are convicted criminals exploiting that civil right to perpetrate crimes upon the public. And there are well-documented, really good data about just the invidiousness of registered sex offenders. They will move to locations that do not follow them very well. They will do all kinds of things that will, and there's great data to support this. I'm talking about genuine criminals. I'm not talking about somebody who may, and by the way, there's an important point you inferred, and I'm just going to state it. There's a myth that gay people are pedophiles. It's totally a myth. There's a myth that gay people or transgender people are very, very, very different in bad sorts of ways. That's also a myth, or they're criminally minded. Totally a myth. That's one thing I want to point out. I'm talking about convicted felons who will exploit every rule possible, and there's great data on this. In fact, the U.S. Department of Justice has what's called a POP Center, Public Oriented Policing Center. They have all kinds of good data on these things. And to be blunt, the literature on this is quite uncomfortable to read quite often, because it's hard to imagine how problematic some people are. And if we can get a shadow of how problematic people are just from their internet behavior, imagine how they are in person.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to wrap up by saying, I think I agree with you on several of the points that you raised, and I think that it's important for us to really identify, and the way, as you put it, genuine transgender people, because they're actually a majority of, when they were polled, a majority of them have experienced their own harassment and their own verbal and physical assault from a lot of these experiences. So yeah, I really appreciate, and I think that we agree on that one point. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hold the rest
points,
of the questions until after all the panel, if that's okay with everybody. So we could hear from...
Thank you, ma'am.
Lasia Casil.
Hafiday and good morning, Senator Lees, Senator Nelson, Vice Speaker Terlaje. Good morning, Senator Augustine, Senator Castro. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to come here and testify. My name is Lasia Casil, and I'm the founder of ISA LGBT Guam and the founder of Guam Pride. And I'm here to express my support in Bill 163-34. In 2015, there was a national transgender survey conducted across America, and I'm just going to read out some of the facts here. 40% of transgender community are not supported by their family. 10% report violence from a family member. 68% report that none of their IDs have the name and gender that they prefer, and cost being the main deterrent. 32% report harassment, they're denied benefits or service, were asked to leave or assaulted when they had to show an ID that does not reflect their gender or presentation. 33% report negative experiences when receiving health care. 40% attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's nearly 9 times the rate of the US population, which is only 4.6%. 77% of students in kindergarten through 12th grade reported being verbally harassed, physically or sexually assaulted. 17% of those said they had to leave school, drop out for their own safety. And 24% that went on to higher education reported harassment, either verbal, physical, or sexual. 15% report unemployment, which is much higher than the national average. 13% report losing a job due to discrimination. 77% took steps to avoid being mistreated by either hiding, delaying their transition, or quitting their jobs. 30% of the transgender community experienced homelessness. 20% report participating in underground economy because they have no other means to survive. By underground economy, talking about sex work or drugs. 57% report fear of asking the police for help if needed. And 59% avoid public restrooms out of fear of confrontations and their own safety. So there's a lot more data out there, and I could go on and on and on. But last year, I participated in a committee led by the former Attorney General, Alicia Limtaco, on transgender law enforcement. And at our first meeting, we had the heads of every single government agency at that meeting, from the police to the DMV, Social Security, teachers, military. And unfortunately, we weren't able to move ahead with that committee due to the current administration. But we were working towards trying to change some of the policies within all of the different government agencies regarding treatment of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. The interesting thing that we found out about Guam was that compared to these national facts taken in these surveys, there's 0 instances of LGBT discrimination reported on Guam, which means we are either living on paradise or there's a real fear of coming forward. Yeah, so there's a real fear, so deeply ingrained. We don't confront this, people don't report the incidences because it's family, we don't want to bring shame. It's a real cultural thing that we determined is one of the factors. And the problem is also not without the community, it's within the community, the LGBT community. Prime example, last year when I was organizing the first Guam Pride March, and I was reaching out to sponsors. One of the responses I got was this particular sponsor didn't want to help us because he was going to alienate his homophobic customers, and that there were clergy and priests that frequented his establishment. And immediately I said, stop, have you not read the papers lately? But he also said to me, which was really, really interesting, that morning he had a meeting with all of his employees, and one of them was gay and had recently gotten married. And even his gay employee was not in support of a Guam Pride event. So this self-loathing is so deeply ingrained in our culture, you know, that our own community doesn't want to step out into the light, you know. And I told him that day, I said, you need to go back and talk to your gay employee and tell him that he has every single pioneer, every person that's participated in a march, who's raised their voices to thank for his right to marry. So yeah, still, you know, a lot of people, they've come out of the closet, but they're still not comfortable with a seat at the table. And all in all, what does this mean for Guam, though? What does this mean for our island when we're not embracing all of our children? Well, in my case, it meant leaving the island. And I know many other people. I read on their Facebook pages, you know, in the LGBT community, that they're not happy here. They want to leave island. They want to go someplace else. There are many talented, loving, compassionate people that just want to contribute to the lifting up of our island. They want to be a part of Guam and contribute in positive ways, but they're persecuted on a daily basis. They're attorneys, they're chefs, they're teachers, they're veterans, they're clergy, government workers, students, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers. You know, Whanaogi is not just for straight people, it's for everyone. In the past couple of years, we've seen some significant changes on this island for the LGBT community, but we still have a way to go. And continually raising awareness and advocating for our rights is a step in the right direction. And I want to thank you, Senator Augustine and Speaker Cruz, for proposing this bill, and for all of you that support this. Siju's Masi. Thank you.
Siju's Masi. Scarlett Dixon.
Good morning, everyone. I'm kind of nervous, but that's okay. I wanted to thank all of you for allowing us to be here and allowing us to provide testimony. I want to start off by saying I don't have a big educational background, but what I have to offer today is my personal experience as a trans woman, and also just being involved in the day-to-day life of a transgender person. I perform with a group of girls called the Untouchables. We've been recognized by the legislature just this year. Obviously, Lassie and I too have been around the same circle of people for a while. And I'm not going to provide statistics today. I'm not going to provide all of that. What I wanted to come here today is say that Guam is special, very special. And I think that a lot of the statistics that she did bring up are very true in the United States, but on Guam, I have a different perspective, and I believe that the island culture is so much more accepting than it was even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I think Lassie and myself have come from different generations, and like she said, there are pioneers and there are people who led the way to that, and I feel her and other people like Crimsonia and all these other pioneers on Guam have really brought that to our island. So today, I'm here because I did send a letter to each and every one of you in the 34th Guam Legislature. I'm not sure if you all received them. And I just wanted to commend Senator San Augustine because you were the only senator that I actually sat with at the table to talk about these issues. I'm not sure the case, but I'm going to give all of you the benefit of the doubt because I feel that this legislature has been the first legislature to really have compassion towards the LGBT community. I don't think that it's fair to say that these days we're suffering from so much discrimination. And personally speaking, I have not been discriminated in a bathroom. I have not dealt with a lot of the deep issues that a lot of my other friends have dealt with, basically because of the way I look, the way I sound. Our society comes to the table and they decide for us what is considered passable, what is acceptable. Because if one of my sisters has a deep voice, they're treated differently than I am. They can't use the restroom, but I can. So for me, this bill is really important because, like I told you, Senator San Augustine, if we allow the current presidential administration, or if we allow other agencies, other schools to dictate how they want to handle a situation, there's no consistency. And my mission was to come here and make sure that there is consistency, that it was equal across the board. It's really sad that any of us have to come here and ask for protections, and it gets really emotional because when you think about all the people who have suffered just for being who you are, it's really sad. I don't agree why we even have discrimination, anti-discrimination laws, because there shouldn't be any. You know, and for people to say that we have to interpret what discrimination is, there's no interpretation. Discrimination is exactly what it is, discrimination. So I just wanted to say that and say that I really appreciate all the efforts that this legislature is doing, and I pray to God that you guys are able to assist more than you already have. So thank you very much for your time and consideration today.
Thank you very much. I have listed, if you would like to also provide oral testimony, please proceed to the table. Brian Dixon, Adrian Davis, Bernalyn Mangoon? All right, if not, well, could you, wait a minute, if you don't mind, if you have some time, I'm going to open up the panel to questions starting with the sponsor of the bill.
I'd wait for my colleagues first.
All right,
no problem.
Thank you. Senator have any questions for the panel? Okay, sure.
Not really a question, but I want to thank you for coming down, and you know, it takes a lot of courage, yes, to come out and share your concern, and no, I hope that we do something, you know, that really protects the rights of the LGBT community. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming down.
Senator San Augustine?
Well, you know, Scarlett and Lasha, right? Okay. Thank you for coming, and thank you for visiting the office. I've told you in the beginning when you approached me about this is that I'm in support of introducing this bill. And, you know, for the people of Guam to just know that, number one, I'm in support of, even I've officiated several weddings of both same-sex, and I have no problem with that one. And you know what? I'm in support of freeing up as much or killing as much discrimination out there as possible, because we all live on one island. We're all one people. We need to move forward, because the island of Guam is beautiful. The people are beautiful, and we're looking at very prosperous years, you know, in the future. And thank you for coming.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, both of you, for coming and for lifting your voices and, you know, ensuring that your perspectives are heard by this body. I think it's really important. I guess my one question to you would be, do you think that the passage of this bill would help our economy and help our families by kind of having Guam, by just illustrating that Guam is a place for all people? Dacia?
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. In fact, earlier this year, I met with the Guam Visitors Bureau to discuss Guam Pride, and I gave them a 60-page PowerPoint presentation on the impact that a Pride event will have on a local economy. And if you look at Pride events around the world, the Sydney Mardi Gras started in 1977 with 5,000 participants. Last year, there were over 750,000 people that came to Sydney to participate in a month-long event. You know, that is contributions, you know, to hotels, to restaurants, taxis, all across the board. In Rio last year, there were over 2 million people that came to visit. You know, and if you look across the board at the LGBT community as tourism, they spend more money than the average tourist, double incomes. In fact, looking at China, the LGBT community of China alone, just the population, LGBT community, is larger than the entire population of France. So I personally think that if we were to embrace more of the LGBT community and support the businesses, this could be a huge boom for Guam. You know, considering the surrounding countries where being LGBT is still discriminated against, people can't get married. There are over 200 Pride events across the world. And, excuse me. And many of them are visited by the same people. They go from one Pride event to another. And, you know, I would love to sit down and discuss with all of you. I'm looking for more support for next year. You know, it could be a huge, huge benefit for Guam for a month-long of events for the entire community to reach out to this new demographic of tourists.
I do have a friend who is a singer, and according to her, she has witnessed a lot of Japanese, Chinese, even Russian citizens who come to Guam basically because we're the closest U.S. soil. It's cheaper to come here. And they do come here to get married, to celebrate their love the way they can, and that's one thing. And just coming back from Saipan recently, a couple weeks ago, I was told by the community there, they're watching us very closely. The Marianas really looks to Guam as their kind of like their chest run, or they look to us for our leadership and how progressive we are as a people. I mean, with the similar cultures, and just hearing that from them, I think it would help. They even ask about, when are you going to have a Pride event? You know, what are you guys doing for Pride? We'd love to fly out and enjoy with you guys and party as one. So I think that I agree with Lassie too, that it would help a lot.
Thank you both very much. And I think that, you know, we're in a little bit of uncharted territory with the current presidential administration. We're not sure how that's going to affect many in our community, but I think that there are several executive orders already in place. So this kind of will allow us to further compete for some federal contracts as well, if we have protections for our community, our entire community in place. So thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank you for being here today. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this bill that would help, we hope, to ensure that young people feel protected, especially, and everyone in our community, and that they feel safe and that they are protected from discrimination based on sex, gender identity, or expression. I also take highly your recommendations regarding the impacts to tourism on Guam or the visitor industry, because I know you are a very successful business person in the tourist industry, especially in the entire community, and there are many of you. But I wish that this bill was going to satisfy all the statistics that you presented and all the problems that really, you know, we might still encounter, and I know it won't, but I think it's just another step that we're going to take in this path and until we get fully there. And I thank you both for your efforts today, and thank you for your leadership. If there are no other people to present testimony on this bill, the committee will continue to remain open to accept testimony until November 16, 2017. You may submit testimonies to my office directly here at the Guam Congress Building or through email at senatorterlajeguam@gmail.com. Next on the agenda, we are going to discuss Bill number 195-34. Bill 195-34 was introduced by Senator Will Castro, Senator Esteves, Senator Nelson, Senator Morrison, and Senator Muña. It is an act to amend Section 2104 and to add Sections A, B, C, D, and E of Chapter 2, Title 20, Guam Code Annotated, relative to amending the Good Samaritan Law. I'd like to ask those who testify or signed up to testify on Bill 195-34 to come to the table, please. And I'd like to invite the sponsor, Senator Castro, to provide opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The bill is designed basically to strengthen the Good Samaritan law as it currently exists. And if I may proceed, I'd like to read the legislative intent into the record and then briefly explain the two fundamental changes to the statute as proposed. So Bill 195-34 essentially finds that the current Good Samaritan law is ambiguous and does not fully protect persons from being tried for civil liability. Legislature in Guam further finds that the people of Guam shall be able to act to save a life without fear of persecution due to damage of property or the failed attempt to perform life-saving measures such as CPR. It is therefore our intent to expound upon the provisions granted by 20 GCA Section 2104 so that the people of Guam may not be discouraged from sustaining and saving a life in dire need of intervention for fear of being persecuted by the law. I want to basically provide a couple of examples for each of the two provisions that's proposed in the bill for change. You know, in one instance, Madam Chair and fellow senators, members of the listening audience, you know, we had the terrible witness of children being left in the most recent example in a parking lot at a private store. And thankfully, emergency personnel were able to respond on time and save a life. But this is not always the case, and we can see throughout the nation that there are instances where people are either reluctant to or actually maybe even callous to acting in order to intervene to save a life. The second example that's local is a lot more egregious and led to the actual loss of life. It's much more of a painful reminder. It stems from an incident at a local restaurant where persons of interest had witnessed, maybe even were a party to the beating of a young man that led ultimately to his death. Unfortunately, ultimately it led to a loss of life, but there wasn't a provision, as you will come to see in the statute, that obligates anybody, whether you're a party to the crime or an innocent bystander or a passerby, to take it upon yourself to at least dial 911. Similarly, and in the United States, there are incidences. There's a recent incident, there's an incident, I'm not sure as to the exact time, of teenagers witnessing an adult male drowning and did nothing to save his or her life. Of course, the intent is not to compel anybody to abridge on your personal and civil liberties to take action to put yourself in harm's way, but to at least compel ourselves as a community, at the very least, to notify emergency personnel. Senators and members of the public, you know, Good Samaritan laws throughout the United States and in countries are designed to protect those who want to provide that kind of service to persons in danger. In essence, a Good Samaritan law is designed to protect any kind of ensuing liability when you put yourself forward to protect life. This bill attempts to extend that coverage in certain instances. For example, it extends that coverage for emergency personnel who are on a voluntary basis, perhaps at a sporting event or some other school competition, from any such liability. And last, another provision of the bill speaks to this concept of a general duty to act. For the record, I do believe that we have a social responsibility to one another, to all those who've chosen to make Guam their home. This responsibility, this social contract, if you will, is consistent with our Pacific way of life. We do have a moral responsibility to take action to prevent harm or injury to others. But as we've witnessed and as I've expressed into the record, we have seen instances where others have chosen to turn a blind eye. So as the law stands in its current form, there is no criminal, nor is there a general duty for failure to act. I am open, though, Madam Chair and senators and members of the public, I'm not quite clear, as this law is formative, on what exactly that criminal liability may be should you choose not to act, to dial 911. And that's subject to open discussion. And with that said, Madam Chair, that pretty much encapsulates the provisions of the bill.
Thank you very much, Senator Castro. I have signed up to testify Dr. Ron McNinch. I don't think he's present, but is there anyone else who would like to testify on the bill? Would any of my colleagues like to ask a question or make a remark on the bill? All right. Senator Castro, would you like to close on the bill?
Sure. Just for purposes of discussion, I know one of my colleagues had asked me for clarity on page 2. With respect, this is line 14, with respect to emergency personnel who may be responding, and I'm open to striking that. And the reason why I'm open to taking that off, I know this will be discussed on the floor when it's finally heard for action, is because there are provisions of law that already govern this. But what this attempts to do, the other language, is cover emergency personnel or other persons of the public even when transporting, let's say, a victim. And so we see that people are reluctant. And it's unfortunate that we live in such a litigious society that people are reluctant to act out of fear that they'll be sued for cracking a glass to save children, or even an animal, a domesticated animal in a truck, as an example, that they wouldn't want to break the glass and they prefer to wait until the arrival of emergency personnel to the scene of an emergency or an accident. And so this extends that type of coverage. Of course, there are provisions, there are certain qualifications that it's, I guess, you know, devoid of negligence or any real intent to harm, or you just really want to foul. And so that's what this piece attempts to do, Madam Chair and Vice Speaker. And so with that said, I thank you so much to the co-sponsors and for my colleagues and to you, Madam Chair, Vice Speaker, for giving me the privilege to hear this in public. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Castro. If I could just confirm, you are proposing that we look at subsection B, or the potential removal of that section? All right. And for those who are listening, I just want to read the main gist of this bill. It adds where we already have an exemption from liability from civil damages for any person who renders emergency care or assistance without compensation at the place of an emergency. We would now be adding this language: a person who knows that another is in mortal danger or serious danger to his or her health and does not give or procure such assistance that, in view of his or her options and the nature of the situation, can reasonably be expected, at the least by calling 911, which is the general duty to act. Any person rendering emergency care shall have the duty to place the injured person under the care of a physician, nurse, or other person qualified to care for such person as soon as possible and obey the instructions of such qualified persons. And there's other language in this bill regarding emergency personnel. All right, I'm going to make another effort to solicit input from the Attorney General and from the medical societies, the two medical societies, if possible, before we report this out. All right. I want to thank my colleagues again for being here today and all those who presented testimony. This bill, the testimony on it will also be open until November 16 for the acceptance of any testimony on any of the agenda items we discussed today. You may submit the testimonies to the Guam Congress Building or through email to Senator Terlaje Guam@gmail.com. And thank you, everyone. The public hearing is now adjourned. The time is 10:54 a.m. Si Diyos masi.